3:10 a.m., August 21st, 1942. A thin ribbon of sand at the mouth of Alligator Creek on Guadalcanal glows pale under a hard tropical moon. 200 Japanese infantrymen surge forward in a tight wave, bayonets fixed, boots splashing through the shallows. 20 yards, 15, 10. The Marines behind their sandbagged positions can see faces now, open mouths, clenched jaws, the whites of eyes. They can hear labored breathing and the metallic click of grenades being primed. Every instinct forged in boot camp screams to fire. Every field manual says you never let an assault close this far. And yet the American line remains silent. No muzzle flash, no shouted order. Just the steady ticking of seconds as the enemy steps deeper into the darkness. It looks like hesitation. It is not. It is calculation. What happens next will not be decided by courage alone, but by geometry, timing, and cold arithmetic, and by a decision that turns orthodox defensive doctrine on its head. To understand why the Marines are holding their fire at the very edge of annihilation, you have to go back to the mindset that brought the attackers here in the first place. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki stands days earlier on the deck of the destroyer Kagero, wind whipping across black Pacific water as Guadalcanal grows from shadow into certainty. In Tokyo and Rabaul, senior officers have begun whispering about what can only be described as victory fever. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese formations have advanced with stunning speed. The Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, each campaign reinforcing the belief that American resistance, once struck hard enough, collapses. Ichiki's regiment had been slated for Midway, a triumph that never materialized after the carrier disaster in June. Denied that stage, his 28th Infantry Regiment now seeks redemption. Intelligence summaries paint Guadalcanal as lightly held, perhaps 3,000 Americans, disorganized after their hurried August 7th landing. A swift, disciplined night assault, hallmark of Imperial infantry doctrine, should scatter them. Ichiki commands 917 men, veterans hardened by China. In his mind, the equation favors boldness. Yet while Ichiki's columns move west from Taivu Point along the coastal track, another equation is being constructed at Henderson Field. Major General Alexander Vandegrift does not command 3,000 Marines. He commands nearly 11,000. More importantly, he understands that Guadalcanal is not a battlefield of maneuver, but of approach corridors and choke points. The sand spit at Alligator Creek, actually the Ilu River's tidal mouth, is narrow, predictable, and exposed. Traditional Marine doctrine emphasizes aggressive counterattack, but Vandegrift, confronted with limited mobility and uncertain naval support, chooses a different path. He studies terrain the way an engineer studies load-bearing stress. He orders pre-registered artillery targets plotted down to precise yard markers. He coordinates interlocking machine gun fields so that no patch of sand lies uncovered. He positions 37mm anti-tank guns loaded not with solid shot, but with canister, each round a steel cylinder packed with 122 balls, transforming the weapon into a giant shotgun. This is not passive defense. It is deliberate entrapment. The Marines will not waste ammunition firing into darkness at maximum range. They will allow the assault to compress, to channel, to stack bodies into the kill zone where artillery observers already have coordinates dialed in. The closer Ichiki's men come, the more lethal the geometry becomes. It is a gamble measured in yards and heartbeats. If discipline breaks, the line collapses. If timing holds, the attackers will discover that spirit alone cannot defy physics. As Ichiki finalizes his plan, he divides his force, confident that shock action will suffice. He underestimates not Marine courage, but Marine preparation. Reconnaissance flights that reported minimal activity mistook concealment for weakness. Radio silence masked reinforcement. The land itself had drawn the lines long before the first Marine drove a stake into the sand. East of Henderson Field, the jungle pressed tight and tangled. A green wall that swallowed platoons whole and spat them out disorganized. North lay the open surf, silver under moonlight, offering no cover to formed units. Between those two extremes ran a thin corridor of inevitability. The sand spit at the mouth of Alligator Creek. At low tide, it became the only practical crossing for a battalion-sized force. Any commander approaching from the east who wanted speed, surprise, and cohesion would be compelled toward that strip of exposed ground. Vandegrift understood that terrain is never neutral. It is a silent accomplice. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock at first resisted the implication. Marines were trained to seize initiative, to patrol aggressively, to strike before being struck. Holding fire until the enemy stood within grenade range felt less like doctrine and more like sacrilege. But each day he walked the perimeter, sighting along barrels and tracing arcs in the sand with his boot. The pattern resolved itself. This was not surrendering initiative. It was redefining it. Water-cooled M1917. A1. Brownings sat low behind parapets, their crews drilled to think not in targets, but in sectors. No gun would chase silhouettes beyond its assigned arc. Neighboring weapons would seal the seams. Mortar tubes and the guns of the 11th Marines had been registered in daylight, their coordinates plotted with surveyor's care so that in darkness a single correction would land steel exactly where intended. The decisive instruments, however, were the 37mm M3 guns loaded with M2 canister. Each round transformed the narrow spit into a corridor of converging projectiles, 122 steel balls unleashed in a cone that widened with lethal certainty. Marine machine gunners were accustomed to engaging at hundreds of yards, exploiting range and visibility. Now they were ordered to wait until 30. 30 yards meant faces. It meant the arc of a grenade could clear a parapet. It meant trusting that overlapping fires and canister blasts would shatter momentum before bodies could pile into the trench. Discipline became as critical as ammunition. Private First Class Franks Pomeroy, crouched behind the water jacket of his Browning, rehearsed the order in his head: hold until commanded. The weapon could spit 500 rounds a minute without overheating, but rate of fire was irrelevant if triggered too soon. The plan assumed compression. It required the attackers to commit fully, to crowd the crossing, to convert enthusiasm into density. Only then would geometry do its work. Behind the line, Company G waited as mobile reserve, perhaps the hardest assignment of all. They would hear the assault, feel the ground tremble, yet remain poised to counterattack only if the lattice of fire failed. Trust replaced impulse. Calculation overrode instinct. As August 20th slipped toward the early hours of the 21st, Coast Watcher reports confirmed movement along the coastal track. Pollock studied the ground one final time, reading it like an engineer reviewing blueprints before a test. The sandbar narrowed at its center, forcing men shoulder to shoulder. Tidal pools flanked the approach, slowing lateral movement. The jungle edge prevented wide envelopment. It was, in pure tactical terms, a funnel. Somewhere in that darkness, Colonel Ichiki's advance guard prepared to validate its doctrine of shock assault. The Marines prepared to validate something newer and colder. That defense, properly constructed, could be an instrument of annihilation rather than endurance. When the first shadows broke from the tree line and rushed toward the surf, the silence along the Marine positions was not hesitation, but synchronization. Pollock felt the pressure like a physical weight as shapes grew clearer, as voices carried over the hiss of waves. 25 yards, 20. Grenades arced forward, some splashing short, others thudding into sand. Still the line held. Pollock came to see the creek not as water and mud, but as a line drawn by nature that invited a single answer. The western bank, slightly elevated and firm underfoot, offered observation down the length of the spit and across the tidal flats. From that rise, a Marine could look east and understand immediately. Any formed body of troops advancing from that direction would be compressed between surf and jungle, forced onto a ribbon of sand scarcely 50 yards across at its widest point. It was less a battlefield than a corridor. The ocean to the north glittered under moonlight but concealed nothing. Silhouettes moving there would be stark against the horizon. To the south, the vegetation thickened into a barrier that broke cohesion and swallowed alignment. The geography itself dictated that a determined assault would strike at the mouth of the creek. Vandegrift and Pollock simply accepted what the land was offering and refined it into a system. Machine guns were not scattered. They were aligned like instruments in an orchestra. Each water-cooled Browning was assigned a sector measured in degrees, its tripod legs dug in, its traversing and elevating mechanisms set against aiming stakes driven into the earth during daylight rehearsals. Crews memorized distances to distinctive clumps of brush, bends in the sand, the faint curve where the spit narrowed. In darkness, when depth perception dissolved, they would not search for targets. They would shift to predetermined reference points and fire by calculation. The water jackets ensured that barrels would not glow and warp under sustained bursts. Overlapping arcs erased dead ground. No attacker could step into a gap without entering another cone of fire. Behind the immediate line, the 11th Marines transformed artillery into something closer to applied science. Observers had walked the eastern bank in daylight, compass and rangefinder in hand, establishing concentration points with the care of surveyors. Each coordinate was transferred to firing charts so that batteries positioned well to the rear could respond in seconds. Night would not reduce them to guesswork. When a call came for a numbered concentration, gun crews would set deflection and elevation exactly as prescribed and fire, confident that steel would land on the pre-selected patch of earth. Darkness, usually an ally of the attacker, would instead become neutralized by preparation. The 37mm guns were the hinge on which the entire design turned. Intended for armor, they were here repurposed as close-range shock weapons. Loaded with canister, each discharge would send 122 steel balls forward in a widening cone, devastating at 20 or 30 yards, where dispersion and velocity reached lethal balance. The spit's narrow width meant that a single round could sweep nearly its entire breadth. But this advantage came with a demand: patience. Fire too soon and the attackers would scatter or drop prone beyond optimal range. Fire too late and grenades would detonate among the parapets. The guns carried only a limited supply of canister. Each shot had to count. For the men on the line, the burden was psychological as much as technical. Pomeroy and his crew knew their weapon could strike effectively far beyond the distances now prescribed. To watch armed soldiers close to within grenade range without firing required suppressing reflex honed by training and instinct. Fire discipline became the true weapon. The sequence was fixed: canister first, machine guns next, artillery sealing the far bank to prevent reinforcement. Each element depended on the others. If timing faltered, the lattice would unravel. Company G waited in covered positions, rifles ready, listening. Their role was insurance. Should any portion of the line buckle under pressure, they would counterattack along pre-planned routes that channeled movement back toward the creek. Even the avenues for potential retreat or breakthrough had been studied so that any penetration would be predictable, not chaotic. Ammunition caches lay stacked in careful allotments. Night pressed down on August 20th with a heavy, tropical stillness. And along the western bank of Alligator Creek, the Marines settled into positions that felt less like foxholes and more like components in a machine. They understood that what was about to unfold would not reward reckless bravery or spontaneous initiative. It would reward restraint. Vandegrift's design asked each man to subordinate instinct to structure, to believe that his narrow sector of responsibility fit into a larger pattern invisible in the dark. The burden was psychological, but the architecture behind it was exact. Soon, theory would be tested at distances measured not in hundreds of yards, but in footsteps. At 3:10 a.m., the quiet fractured. The sound came first: water disturbed by boots, the muted splash of men moving with urgency. Shapes detached from the jungle edge and flowed onto the pale ribbon of sand. Pomeroy leaned into the rear sight of his Browning, the water jacket cool against his forearm, the gun already aligned to its assigned arc. The advancing figures were exposed, silhouetted by moonlight. Every lesson about seizing fire superiority urged him to squeeze the trigger now, but the order was to wait. The geometry demanded compression. The Japanese assault force moved with assurance born of previous victories. Officers hissed commands. Equipment rattled as men negotiated uneven footing in the tidal channels. They believed they were striking a perimeter caught unprepared, relying on night and momentum to fracture resistance. What they could not perceive was that every yard they gained carried them deeper into a prearranged convergence. The sand spit narrowed toward its center. Lateral movement was constrained by surf and mud. The attackers were stacking themselves inside a funnel without realizing it. 10 yards. Pollock's command cut through the tension like a blade. The response was not chaotic, but sequenced. The 37mm guns fired first, their canister rounds transforming the crossing into a corridor of steel. At such close range, the dispersion was brutal and immediate. Momentum collapsed as bodies fell across the sand. Before the shock could dissipate, the Brownings joined in, their sustained rhythm knitting overlapping fields that erased any safe path forward or back. Pomeroy swept his sector exactly as rehearsed, trusting adjacent guns to seal the margins. Mortars and artillery, called onto pre-registered points, struck the eastern bank to isolate the assault from reinforcement. The design unfolded precisely as intended, yet battle resists perfection. A handful of attackers, driven by ferocity or simple chance, forced their way through the storm and reached the western side. Grenades detonated in shallow pits. Bayonets flashed in close quarters. For a brief moment, the line flexed under unpredictable pressure. But this too had been anticipated. Company G surged from reserve positions along predetermined routes, rifles and grenades clearing the intrusions before they could expand. Their counterattack was sharp and contained, restoring continuity before any foothold could harden into a breach. The defensive lattice bent, but did not break. Across the creek, Japanese officers struggled to reassert control. Mortars began dropping rounds into marine positions, followed by the bark of 70mm infantry guns, attempting to suppress the lethal arcs that had shattered the first wave. Explosions churned sand and palm trunks, but the American guns were already dug in and sighted. The artillery network adjusted calmly, shifting fires to silence enemy tubes and scatter troops reforming on the far bank. Darkness no longer belonged to the attacker. It had been mapped, measured, and weaponized. By the time the eastern horizon hinted at dawn, the creek mouth had become a testament to disciplined execution. The initial assault had been broken not by improvisation, but by synchronization, each element activating at the moment assigned to it. Mortar shells continued to fall along the marine perimeter, bursts of orange flame briefly exposing the wreckage on the sandbar and the churned craters along the western bank. Fragments hissed through palm fronds and slapped into parapets. Pomeroy kept his cheek welded to the stock of his Browning, forcing himself to scan methodically rather than flinch at each detonation. The gun's water jacket steamed faintly in the humid air, but it held steady. The mechanism cycled cleanly, a reassurance amid concussion and dust. Around him, men checked ammunition belts, cleared stoppages, and waited for the next movement in the darkness. The first assault had validated the design. The question now was whether the attackers would adapt or repeat. They repeated. A second wave advanced with visible effort at cohesion, stepping around fallen bodies, officers attempting to maintain alignment under fire. From the marine line, the geometry was unchanged. The crossing was still narrow, the dispersion still constrained. Pollock allowed the formation to thicken within the funnel before giving the command. Canister erupted again, tearing into the densest cluster at precisely the range intended. Brownings followed without hesitation, their arcs refined by experience from the previous exchange. Any fractional delays that had allowed isolated penetrations earlier were gone. The coordination was sharper, the transitions seamless. Survivors attempting to rally found no unguarded seam, no pocket of shadow to exploit. The defensive lattice, once theoretical, had matured into practiced execution. Still, the Japanese commanders sought an answer. As the eastern sky hinted at gray, they shifted tactics. Troops moved north along the shoreline, splashing into the surf in an attempt to skirt the left flank through deeper water beyond the spit. On paper, it was imaginative. Bypass the choke point, negate the killing funnel, appear where the arcs were presumed thinner. In practice, it revealed how thoroughly the terrain had been studied. Marines on the northern sector had unobstructed observation into the surf zone. Men wading chest-deep with rifles raised presented steady silhouettes against the breakers. Movement in water robbed them of speed and balance. Recoil and return fire were nearly impossible. Machine guns engaged at comfortable ranges, their beaten zones raking the foam. Artillery observers, already aware that the surf might become an alternate avenue, called for pre-registered concentrations timed to the minute. Shells detonated amid the swells, geysers of spray and sand collapsing formations that were already struggling to maintain footing. The sea itself amplified the violence. Concussion traveled through water as well as air, compounding disorientation. What had been conceived as a maneuver became another exposure to measured fire. By full dawn, the pattern was unmistakable. Every axis of approach, sandbar, shoreline, surf, had been anticipated and assigned a response. The Japanese assault, driven by resolve and reinforced by habit, collided repeatedly with a defense that translated ground into advantage and time into synchronization. Pomeroy, eyes gritty from smoke and exhaustion, continued to traverse his sector, though organized movement on the eastern bank was thinning. Sporadic mortar rounds fell short or wide as crews were suppressed or displaced. The battlefield settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by isolated shots and the distant crash of waves. The creek mouth, once a narrow crossing, had become a barrier defined by consequence. The Marines had not merely held, they had demonstrated that discipline under pressure could turn proximity from liability into force multiplier. As sunlight exposed the scale of the repulse, it was clear that the night's fighting had resolved more than a local engagement. It had affirmed that on Guadalcanal, calculation would blunt shock and preparation would punish repetition. The attackers had tested the system from multiple angles and found it coherent at every point. Machine gun arcs stitched the surf with relentless accuracy, converging on the last flanking elements struggling through the breakers. Men burdened by rifles and ammunition fought both tide and trajectory, and the sea that was meant to shield them instead magnified their vulnerability. What might have unsettled a looser perimeter became, here, another confirmation that the ground had already been solved like a problem set. With first light spreading across Guadalcanal, Vandegrift shifted from containment to conclusion. The defensive lattice had fixed the enemy in place. Now it would be folded shut. Lieutenant Colonel Cresswell's 1st Battalion, 1st Marines moved inland, crossing the upper reaches of Alligator Creek well beyond the night's carnage. The maneuver was not dramatic. It was deliberate. By stepping across the creek several thousand yards upstream, the battalion avoided the choke point entirely and began advancing down the eastern bank in coordination with artillery that continued to suppress any attempt at reorganization. Pre-registered concentrations that had isolated assault waves hours earlier now screened the envelopment, falling ahead of the infantry to keep survivors disoriented and dispersed. As Cresswell's Marines pivoted back toward the coast, the geometry inverted. The force that had tried to force a crossing found itself pressed toward the same shoreline, compressed between advancing infantry and the sea. Armor joined the equation in daylight. Tanks, withheld during darkness to prevent confusion and fratricide, rumbled across the sandbar once visibility allowed positive identification. One vehicle detonated a mine and was disabled, a reminder that no design eliminates risk entirely. The remaining tanks, however, added mobile firepower that could engage stubborn pockets and shield riflemen during the final sweep. Combined arms, Infantry, artillery, armor now operated in sequence rather than desperation. What had begun as a defensive experiment matured into a coordinated offensive closure. Above, Marine aircraft from VMF 223, newly arrived at Henderson Field, made their presence felt with strafing passes along the beach approaches. Their intervention was less about dramatic dogfights than about sealing exits, ensuring that fragmented groups could not slip north along the sand. Ground and air operated on shared timing, reinforcing the sense that the battle was being conducted according to plan rather than reaction. By late afternoon, organized resistance had collapsed. Isolated shots echoed from brush and tidal pools, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. When the sun rose fully on August 22nd, the scale of the repulse became starkly visible. The sandspit and adjacent beach were strewn with the evidence of repeated frontal assaults funneled into converging fire. Estimates varied, but hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay where geometry had trapped them. Only a small number were taken alive, most severely wounded. American losses, though painful and permanent, were comparatively light. The exchange was not merely numerical, it was doctrinal. A position engineered for compression and timing had withstood shock tactics that had succeeded elsewhere in the Pacific. Colonel Ichiki's fate underscored the collision of approaches. Accounts differed on the precise circumstances of his death, yet what remained undeniable was that an officer seasoned in rapid offensive action had encountered a defense built on calculation rather than impulse. The defeat reverberated beyond the creek mouth. For Japanese commanders, it challenged assumptions about the inevitability of night assault and moral ascendancy. For the Marines, it validated a shift in thinking. Discipline and terrain analysis could convert proximity into advantage, and patience could amplify firepower.